Welcome back to PN&L channel, where we create content with practical IT solutions. If our videos are helpful to you, kindly subscribe to this channel. Click the thumbs up button and let us know in the comment section what you would like to see. In this video, we will continue our implementation of OpenStack High Availability by installing and configuring OpenStack Nova on all three controller nodes in our environment. In the next video, I will demonstrate how to install and configure Nova on compute nodes. Before we dive into today's demonstration, I will define some key OpenStack Nova concepts. OpenStack Nova provides a way to provision compute instances, aka virtual servers or virtual machines in the VMware world. Nova supports creating virtual machines, and it runs a set of daemons on top of existing Linux servers to provide that service. It requires the following additional OpenStack services for basic function. For example, Keystone, Glance, Neutron, which is the networking service in OpenStack, and Placement, which is a REST API, as we discussed in previous video. Nova can also integrate with other services to include persistent block storage and encrypted disks. So this deployment will consist of the following components: Nova API service, which provides the external REST API to users. That's allowing instances of virtual servers to be created using the web interface. In this case is OpenStack uses what we call Horizon, which is a web interface. Then there is the Nova scheduler and placement services. These are responsible for tracking the resources and deciding which compute node instances should be on, as we discussed in the previous video, which placement uses REST API to do that rather than going to the command line and type in the commands to create the virtual instances. But it will be easier for developers to be able, or users to be able to create instances using the web interface, and the REST API allows us to do that. There is the API database that is used primarily by Nova API and Nova Scheduler, called API level services, right? To track location information about instances. That's, for example, when you migrate an instance from one compute node to another. This is where the Nova's API and the Nova scheduler allows us to track the information about the instances, and as well as the temporary location for instances being built that are not yet scheduled. And then there is the Nova Conductor service, which offloads long-running tasks for the API level services and insulates compute nodes from direct database access. And then there is the Nova Compute service, which manages the virtual driver and the hypervisor host. And the OpenStack Nova uses the concept of cell database, which is used by API, conductor, and compute services, and they house the majority of the information about the instances. And then there is the cell zero database, which is, as we mentioned, like a cell database. It contains only instances that fail to be scheduled, and or well, they fail to be scheduled, or that are in the process of being created. This database, it mimics a regular cell but has no compute nodes, and it is used only as a place to put instances that fail to land on the real compute node, and thus the real cell. And then there is the message queue, which allows the services to communicate with each other via RPC. That's why we, in the previous video, in one of the videos, installing and configuring RabbitMQ, which is the messaging queue. This allows communication between the services, as I mentioned, via RPC. So these are the basic Nova components that we're going to be installing in this video. So as we've demonstrated earlier, all the information that we're going to create are going to be stored in a database, and in my case I'm using MariaDB. So I'm going to create the Nova database, Nova API database, and also the Nova Cell 0 that we mentioned earlier on, where the information about the failed instances, well, the instances that are failed to be scheduled. So that's where we're going to store that. So we're going to use this command to create the database. So as we can see here, so we've created the database, and we are able to grant the privileges to the Nova user as well. So in order to validate, we can say show databases. As you can see, we have the Nova API and the Nova Cell 0, and you can see we have the placement database, the Keystone database, and the Glance database. So next, we're going to create the Nova user on controller 1. Most of this user creation is going to be done on the first controller node, in order to avoid conflicts and confusion in the database. So as you can see, that has been, the user Nova has been created, and next we are going to add the Nova user that we created into the admin role. There will be no output for that because we're just adding a role, and that is successful. So next we're going to create the Nova service entity, and everything is being done, as you can see, on the controller node, and that is done. Next, we are now going to create the compute API service, which is the public, admin, and the internal API service endpoints. So as you can see, we're going to be using the virtual IP host name, or we can use the IP, or we can use the host name. The reason why we can use the host name is because we've already added the IP address and the host name of the virtual IP in the slash etc/hosts file. So press enter. So it's going to create the endpoints. So the public has been created, internal, and admin. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to install the Nova component on all controller nodes. So this is what we're going to do. Install. All right, that is complete. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create all the certificates directory, and copy all the certificates and the keys certificate authority and the certificates from into the respective Nova folder. So we're going to do that on all controller nodes. Next, we're going to start configuring the nova.conf file. First, we're going to comment out the SQLite connection, because we're going to be connecting to MariaDB database or MySQL database. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to comment out the lock path, because we're going to create a new lock path as we move on. Next, we're going to configure the IP address of each in the nova.conf file. Next, we're going to be configuring the transport URL, which is basically the RabbitMQ, as we mentioned earlier on, that Nova uses the message queue to communicate between services via the RPC. So we're going to configure the okay, that's correct. So we're going to add that to all the other controller nodes. Next, we're going to configure the database connectivity entry into the, so there are two connectivity that we're going to configure in the connectivity parameter we're going to configure in the nova.conf. One is going to be for Nova and the Nova API. So if we look from if we look at the database here, so we have Nova and the Nova API. So these two we're going to be connecting to that database. Okay, I think there is a mistake here. So the IP address of the database is 118.10.10. Okay, that has been corrected. So the mistake was that I'm using .10.10, which is wrong configuration. So I'm going to use this. Be sure that if I don't correct that, the connectivity to the database is going to fail. Okay, as you can see, we're connected to the API. And we're also connected to the Nova database, which is correct. Next, we're going to add that to the Next, we're now going to create a new lock path as we the lock path was that we commented out earlier on was created under the default, but it's meant to be under the Oslo concurrency. If you see here, so the lock path here is under the defaults, but it's meant to be under the Oslo concurrency. As you can see here, this is where it's meant to be, and we do the same for all the controllers. Next, we're going to add the API paste config. Okay, so this here is wrong. So it's supposed to be under WSGI. So it's supposed to be under 5608. Something is wrong here. So it's supposed to be API. Okay. Okay, that is complete. Next, we're going to define the parameters for the keystone, because the keystone is going to allow users to be able to authenticate and granted authorization to use the REST API. So we're going to be going to keystone underscore authorization. So the keystone authorization is going to be consisting of the auth type, project name, username and password, and the auth URL, the www authenticate URI, memcache servers, and the certificate files that we created earlier on. So we're going to save that because we're still going to go in there and add some more configuration. Save that and do the same for okay. Next, we're going to add the neutron configuration to each one of the controller nodes. So here we're going to add the firewall driver. That's what we're going to use to add the firewall configuration in Neutron. We'll talk more about that when we're configuring Neutron. Next, we're going to be configuring some parameters under the scheduler. Okay, if I can spell it correctly. So here we're going to be configuring the block device allocation retries. That's what when you're adding virtual disk to the what's it called, to the instances. So let's for here with the discover host cell interval. So basically this is used to when you add a new compute node into the into the um, into the mix, just to expand your computing power. If you add a new compute node, this is the interval to which it keeps on polling to discover the host. And 4798. Next, we're going to configure what is called the service token roles required. token rows required. So this is right here. Set that to true. So 893. Next, we now add the block device allocate retries. Okay, so the block allocate retries block device. That to 400. Then we add the block device allocate retries interval. We configure that to be 3. Retries interval. So the next thing we're going to configure is we're going to configure the VNC for each of the controller. So the VNC is more like the virtual network computing that we're going to be using to access the uh, the compute nodes. Sorry, not the compute nodes. I mean the virtual machines or instances, as it's being called in OpenStack. So as you can see, the server is listening on each of the, oh my bad, I think I have to change the IP address here to 122. Okay, that is done. And the next thing is we're going to save the file. And then we copy this, we create this self.pem. I'm still researching on why we have to do this, but please make sure you configure this. It's very important. Next, we're going to go back to the Nova config file. And we're going to add the placement parameters consistent of the region name and so on and so forth. Next, we're going to configure the cache. This is where we configure the memcached that we configured when we were configuring Keystone. Next, we're going to add the configuration, the certificates for the class, because we're going to be using certificates to allow encryption in the communication between the services, between the Glance backend. So we save the file because we're going to now populate the database with the information we've configured in the nova.com file. So we're going to start to populate the Nova API. We can ignore the error message. So if we go back to Nova API, show tables. Okay, so we're good to go with Nova API. So next we're also going to also register the cell 0 database as well. All this is meant to be done on the controller node, on the first controller node only. Next we're going to create a new cell 1 on okay. So next we're now going to populate the Nova database. As you can see, we have all the messages populated in there. So next we're going to verify the registration of the cell in cell 1. Okay, so as we can see, we have been able to populate the cell node and it's connected to the RabbitMQ, and this using this and the password, username and password. So the next thing we're going to now create is we're going to create the minimize that and ensure that we have our real estate back. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to create the web access in on the controllers. This is going to be, we're basically using the API that we discussed earlier. So this is the parameters, and we're going to add it to nova.conf. We're going to check that. You see Apache sites enabled nova.conf. There we go. So we're going to do that on all the other controllers, so that way. So for this one, we're going to change okay, that's correct there. Save that, and we do the same thing on the third controller. And we change the IP address on the third controller as well to match the IP address. Okay, that is complete. Then we now finalize installation by restarting the services. So in order to eliminate conflict between Apache and Nova, always ensure that you restart all the previous services. So this is the command to restart the entire service. We will wait for it to complete. In this, at this point, we're going to test the configuration of the OpenStack, and let's see. We're going to run this command curl https and the virtual hostname and also the port 8774, and 8774 is what Nova uses to communicate with other services, or that is the port that is being used to communicate with OpenStack services. The next thing we're going to now check is the services, if the services are up and running in OpenStack. So we're going to run the OpenStack compute service list. As you can see here, the Nova scheduler, conductor, scheduler, the conductor and scheduler. They are all up, as you can see here. So in the next video, we're going to be talking about installation of Nova and compute services on the compute node. I hope this is informative for you, and I hope to see you in the next video. Please click on the subscribe button and also give us a thumbs up if this video is helpful to you. Thank you, and see you in the next video. Enjoy your day.